Wonderful. Okay, we're going to begin. Hello, everyone. I am Pete Davis. I'm the director of the Democracy Policy Network, and welcome to the first meeting of the Democracy Policy Network's Democracy Dollars Working Group. We have, it's very exciting today. We have 38 states and 100 state leaders and staffers represented as interested in this event. We think this may be the largest gathering of state legislators interested in democracy dollars ever. A technical note before we begin, if you didn't hear me as I was beginning, we are hosting this as a meeting instead of a webinar, so you can see each other's faces and know you are not alone in your interest in democracy dollars across the country. But to make that work, we need everyone to stay muted. And if you want to have your video on, though, that will add to the ambiance. A bit about the Democracy Policy Network before we get to democracy dollars. We are an interstate policy network that works to empower people to raise up ideas that deepen democracy, and democracy in the broadest sense of the term, more power to more people in more ways. We do that first by gathering, packaging, and organizing transformative state policies, and second, getting them in front of folks like you, policy-minded, democratically spirited state leaders and staffers. If you want to learn more and learn about future events, visit our name online at democracypolicy.network. Now on to the mission of this working group. The mission of what we're doing particularly here today is to help raise up policy around democracy dollars or democracy vouchers in your state houses in the coming session. The working group is going to work like a funnel. Today, we want as many people as possible. Everyone is invited. We're going to have a broad briefing on what democracy dollars are and effective strategies for raising up them in your state. Then we're going to end the session asking you in a poll, are you interested in getting serious? Who wants to take this to the next level? Who wants to raise up democracy dollars in their 2022 sessions? And invite those people to stay in touch through communication channels and come back for a more intimate session on the nuts and bolts of really particularly and concretely what you need to make that happen, what questions you need answered, what talking points work best, what way to draft your legislation. And then from there, for those who are ready to follow through in 2022, we're going to keep everyone in the loop and see if we can get some, for lack of a non-corporate word, synergies of launching democracy dollars in multiple state houses at the same time. Can we share materials? Can we share access to experts? Can we tip off the national press that something is happening? But today, we are going to do 5 things. I'm going to finish up this introduction. We're going to do a policy overview about what are democracy dollars, how do they work. Then we're going to do a strategy overview, hearing from 4 different folks that have fought for democracy dollars all across the country. We're going to go a little bit into working group next steps, and we're going to end on a Q&A for this wonderful panel to hear from you. So let's get started with our experts. Here today, we have 7 wonderful experts and advocates on democracy dollars. And as they are speaking, feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the end if we have time and they have not been answered by a panelist yet. So without further ado, and as I'm seeing in the chat as well, feel free to drop who you are and where you're from and your interest in democracy dollars in the chat as well. We want that chat to be a live community building as we're going. So without further ado, we wanted to begin very concretely with someone who has experience with a democracy vouchers dollars system in practice. And here today we have the wonderful Colleen Echohawk. She is a civic leader in Seattle. She's a founder of the Coalition to End Urban Native Homelessness, and she was a recent candidate for mayor of Seattle. And she used democracy vouchers to fundraise. Just to show how real this is, as we were prepping for this event, I found a Facebook video where she posted, where she said, and this is a little window into a democracy vouchers future. It sounded exactly like a fundraising video, but it was totally different. She said, we are only 615 democracy vouchers away from our goal of 10,000 vouchers. So she's done a democracy vouchers fundraiser as a mayoral candidate. So Colleen, could you tell us a bit about your experience running for mayor of Seattle under a democracy vouchers system? How did it change the game? Why did you want to join us today to talk more about democracy vouchers? Over to you, Colleen.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Pete. I am excited to be here. Democracy vouchers were certainly one of the reasons that I decided to run for mayor. And I'm glad to share with you a little bit about my experience. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Colleen Echohawk. I'm an enrolled member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. For the past 15 years, I have served Native people who are experiencing homelessness in the city of Seattle, and also started a national network of Native people who support other Native people who experience the highest rates of homelessness in our city. I decided to run for mayor because of how frustrated I have been around our response to homelessness in the city of Seattle. If you are not aware, we have some of the highest rates of homelessness in one of the richest cities in the world. And so I jumped into the race knowing that I was going to be running against some pretty formidable folks who've already been in this world. I ran against two council members who had, already won elections, were very, very well known. In fact, they are the two that made it through to the general. I came in third, and with about 12% of the vote. And I experienced such an incredible, it was such an incredible thing. I don't know if I've never run for office before. I did not expect to run for office, but it was a really amazing journey, and it was made easier and possible because of the democracy voucher program we have here in Seattle. It was the first time we have used democracy vouchers for the mayoral race. I can remember I was one of the first people to announce, and I was also one of the first people to get qualified for the democracy voucher program. Here in Seattle, you have to have 600 signatures and $10 donations to qualify. That was good. I think that the qualification actually is a little bit too rigid of a standard. I would like to see that change in the future. But for someone like me who comes from the Native community, who comes from a place where I don't have I just had never done it before. I did not have some of the networks that some of the folks had. I hadn't the last time I had been involved with the Democratic Party, even though I'm, supported it and have been, but I hadn't done anything, was when caucusing for Obama. Like it had been so long since I had done anything in this world, but felt compelled to because of the homelessness crisis. And democracy vouchers certainly helped me, not help me, they were essential for the work. Some of the experiences around democracy vouchers was that when we went out there to ask people for money, people loved it, but they didn't understand. We had to describe to people over and over again, this is what the democracy voucher program is, even though it had been used in elections here in Seattle before. We had some, I honestly think misuse of the democracy voucher. We had some candidates who paid canvassers to go out there and gather the democracy vouchers, and people didn't know what they were, and they just signed up. They thought, someone would be out there saying, do you want to solve homelessness? Here, sign over your democracy voucher. And it was not clear what was happening. So I think that as we move forward with this program here in Seattle, we want to be, telling people, spreading the word, being the, helping people fully understand what the democracy voucher program is and how they can be a part of it. The final thing I want to say is that, I am from the Native community here in Seattle. I've worked with Native homeless people for the past 15 years. I got to work with I got to help people sign over the democracy voucher to me who had never been involved in the political world at all. They had never donated. They had never had anyone ask them to donate to them because they were experiencing homelessness and they had no money, but they were able to participate in this civic dialogue in a way that they had never been able to before. And to me, that was one of the greatest parts about having the democracy voucher program here in Seattle. I still kind of get chills when I think about it, getting to see folks who, had no money, had no homes, but they were able to donate to my campaign. So that was thrilling. I'm excited to continue to be a part of the democracy voucher and democracy dollar programs around the country. And I'm really grateful for this time. Look forward to your questions in the future. And thank you all for being here and for your amazing work. Congrats.
Thank you so much, Colleen. And I'm so glad you ended on that, because this is why we at Deepen are excited about democracy dollars. with a matching fund system or a lump sum system, the candidates might be able to get public money to run, but the voters don't get that experience of giving your democracy dollars. And that is the type of thing where it brings you deeper into the democratic system. You want to continue supporting that campaign. You want to continue participating because only the democracy dollar system expands that experience of giving one, not just the experience of receiving one. And I'm so glad you talked about
it was my favorite thing about it. It really like just, I have a huge smile on my face right now because it really like was life-changing for some folks who never, who now will be further engaged in the process, but had never had the opportunity before. So it was amazing.
Amen. I love that. It's like a chance to vote before you vote that gets you practicing, oh, I'm going to support someone. It's amazing. So, so wonderful. Thank you for that wonderful articulation of the why of democracy vouchers. Now we're going to move from the why to the what. Tom Latkowski here is a policy researcher with the Democracy Policy Network. He's the author of what I believe might be the first ever book fully on democracy vouchers called Democracy Vouchers, How Bringing Money into Politics Can Drive Money Out of Politics. I don't have a copy of the book here, but Tom, if you have one near you, maybe you can raise it up. And it's available at democracyvouchers.org. Tom, could you flesh out what is a democracy voucher system? How does it work as a system? Give us the overview of what Colleen and the other mayoral and council members experienced in Seattle.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Pete, and thanks everyone for being here. I apologize for my voice. I'm a little bit under the weather at the moment, but hopefully I'm still understandable for the most part. So as Pete started to say, democracy vouchers are situated within the broader public financing landscape. So lots of states already have some form of public financing program. Often that's a matching funds program or a lump sum grants program. Some states have tax credits, other systems like that. But we see democracy vouchers as the best and the frontier system for a few reasons, mainly because, as Pete talked about, democracy vouchers are the only system that empower regular folks to become, to increase their engagement in the political process, right? Matching funds don't do that. Lump sum grants don't do that. So in Seattle, they passed their program in 2015, and Estevan Muñoz-Howard can speak to that a little bit more. Candidates qualify initially, as Colleen spoke to, by collecting a small number of small donations to prove, that they're a serious candidate. That there's a history in Seattle and in Washington State of some oddballs. One candidate who calls himself Good Space Guy, running for office repeatedly. So the program didn't want any of those candidates to receive vouchers. So candidates qualify by getting a small number of small donations. And then everyone in the city gets 4 vouchers worth $25. And that's important to emphasize. This was a choice that the program made when it was first passed, was to give vouchers to every resident in the city of Seattle, not even just to registered voters or to citizens. So that means if you are 18 years or older, and if you're a legal permanent resident who lives in the city of Seattle, you have access to democracy vouchers. So every registered voter, their addresses are on file with the city already, because Seattle and Washington State has all vote by mail elections. And they receive their vouchers automatically, I believe in February of the election year. But if you're not a registered voter, or even if you're not a citizen, you can submit a form to receive your vouchers as well, or do that online. And so folks get their vouchers, and then we're off to the races. Candidates come door to door, ask you for your vouchers. Candidates can bring replacement forms if you've lost your vouchers and help you to fill them out. And then candidates turn in those $25 vouchers for real money with the city government. The final thing that's important to emphasize is that all public financing systems are optional. So this is true of democracy vouchers. This is true of matching funds and everything else. This is a requirement from the Supreme Court. What that means is that if candidates don't like the public financing system or don't want to use it, they are still free to run under the old system, right? So in Seattle, not many, but some candidates have made this choice and have decided that they prefer to run fully with private contributions. But what that means is that if a candidate does opt in to the public financing program, to the democracy vouchers program, the city can place additional requirements on them, right? Literally what candidates do is they sign a contract with the Seattle Ethics and Elections Commission to opt into the program. And so that means the city can have additional requirements that they couldn't put on all candidates, right? Because they'd be unconstitutional if you put them on all candidates. But if candidates are opting in, then that's okay. So in Seattle, that's included decreasing private contribution limits, overall caps on campaign spending, even requiring attendance at public debates, things like that, that you, again, could never do normally, right? Requiring the candidates attend public debates would not be constitutional normally. But because candidates are opting in to the Democracy Vouchers program, they're essentially signing agreement with that requirement. So one more thing that I'll speak to is the importance, once the program is in place, of continuing public outreach. This is something that Seattle tried to emphasize. The city of Seattle contracted with a number of community-based organizations to hold events to try and increase awareness about the Democracy Vouchers program, right? Colleen spoke to this. This was a brand new thing, right? It was passed in 2015, first used in 2017. This had never been done anywhere else in the country. So it makes sense that a lot of Seattle residents were unfamiliar with how this worked. And so I think that's just something that's very important to emphasize. When you're writing legislation or advocating for a system in your city or state, you also have to consider the implementation piece, right? There need to be some funds set aside or some people whose job it is to help promote the system and ensure that everyone understands it. If we don't do that, what can happen is the only folks that will use their democracy vouchers, or disproportionately the folks who will use their vouchers, will be the folks who already vote, right? Who already are politically engaged. And that's not what we want. We want this to be a system that increases engagement among all communities. And so it's just very important to emphasize that outreach piece to make sure that everyone understands vouchers and can use them.
Thank you, Tom. And we just got a question in the chat, if you could take 30 seconds to answer, which is, it's not, it's a question on how do they cap the amount of vouchers in the whole system? You know, if a voucher system has a certain budget, how do they limit how vouchers are allocated?
Sure, yeah, so there are two ways. One is just very simply the city of Seattle announces an overall amount. Here's how much we're going to spend this cycle, right? And if they hit that, they release all candidates from the restrictions. We go back to, you know, the worst case scenario is we go back to the status quo, the way things are now. That has never happened, but they have that overall number to ensure that they know what their budget will be. The other thing that they do is, as I said, candidates who sign up for the voucher program have a spending limit on them. So I won't quote numbers because I don't want to get it wrong. But if you're a mayoral candidate, you know how many vouchers you're going to be able to redeem, because if you take more than that, you'll cross your spending limit, right? And so that is kind of a built-in restriction on how much the program will cost the city.
So it's an overall system or a individual limit system.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Tom, for this overview. We'll get to more questions at the end. And, you know, we wanted to bring in Dr. Jen Heerwig next, because this all sounds nice, but does it actually work? And what can we do to make it work better is something people might be thinking. And fortunately, Jen has studied democracy vouchers. She's a political sociologist at Stony Brook University. And Jen, when you looked at the democracy voucher system, what did you find, and what lessons from your findings can we take away in designing democracy voucher systems in the states that all these attendees are from? We currently have 51 folks here from dozens of state offices. What should they learn from Seattle? What's the good stuff? What's the stuff that still needs work?
Thanks. So I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see? Thumbs up?
It is being shared, yep.
Oh, cool. Okay. So what I'm going to do in my 5 minutes is share some big takeaways from our research on the Seattle Democracy Voucher Program in 2017 and 2019. And I wanted to just mention that this work is co-authored with Brian McCabe, who is at Georgetown University. So I'm speaking on behalf of both of us. Since 2017, Brian and I have been studying the program. We have 2 publications on the 2017 election. One is a policy brief and one is a published paper in the Election Law Journal. And then we also analyzed the results of the 2019 elections as well. And our goal in all of this research has been to look at the question of how the Democracy Voucher Program has diversified the donor pool in Seattle. Has the program worked to actually bring in folks who ordinarily would not participate in the campaign finance system, as Colleen just mentioned? So from that research on 2017 and 2019, I want to offer you three big takeaways from our kind of combined research program on Seattle. The first big takeaway on the program is that democracy vouchers increase participation in local campaign finance by a lot. The second big takeaway that I want to share with you is that democracy vouchers have helped to diversify donors in local elections in Seattle. And third, the program has moved the pool in a more diverse direction, but there are still some disparities. And I know that Seattle is working on making the program more accessible to all kinds of folks in Seattle. So on that first point, I wanted to share some data with you. This graph is comparing the number of donors in local Seattle races, both before the Democracy Voucher Program was implemented and after. And as you can see, right, in 2013, there were fewer than 10,000 unique cash donors in Seattle races. So this is before the program was implemented. I have to say that as a rate of the overall voting population in Seattle, that's actually not even that bad in comparison to other cities around the country. So less than 10,000 unique donors in 2013. You can see by 2019, which is the second cycle of the program, we have almost 40,000 unique people, unique voucher users in the system, right? So a quadrupling of the number of folks who are participating in local elections in this way. So a really spectacular increase in participation in Seattle in just 2 election cycles of the Democracy Voucher Program. The second big takeaway from our research has been to note that the Democracy Voucher Program has diversified donors in local elections. So it's not just that we're getting more participation, but we're getting more participation from folks who are typically underrepresented in the campaign finance system. So Democracy Voucher users are more diverse than cash donors along lines of race, class, and age. If we look at the data, we see that younger, lower income, and people of color are better represented in the campaign finance system now than they were, or than they are relative to cash donors. I do want to put a little bit of a caveat on that and say that the results for 2017, the first election cycle, were stronger than for 2019 for reasons that we talk about in our policy brief if you're interested. The third big takeaway from our research is that although we are seeing gains in the diversity of donors relative to those cash donors in local elections, more work remains to be done. So if you can think about an analysis of the system where we're kind of ranking the diversity of different players in the system, voters are the most diverse, followed by voucher users, followed by cash donors. So voucher users have moved closer to looking like all voters in Seattle, but they haven't quite made it all the way. So they're much better than cash donors, but they're not all the way representative of voters in Seattle. So people of color, younger folks, lower income residents are still a smaller share of those democracy voucher users than voters overall. They look better than cash donors, but not quite exactly like voters in Seattle. Why might the program still have some work to do along the lines of bringing folks into the campaign finance system? What we're learning as we look at the data is that local political dynamics are playing a big role in how the program is functioning to diversify donors. One hypothesis that we're testing now is that the program works in part by enabling diverse candidates to mount effective, viable campaigns. And so to the extent that you can bring in more diverse local candidates, you're going to also in turn diversify the people who are participating because they're seeing people who look like them, who are running to represent them. So we're looking at that question now and gearing up to analyze the 2021 results that will come in at the end of this year. Finally, I just wanted to note, if the research is helpful to all of you in the policy community, I put it all in one place on my website, so you can go and download it, including the academic paper, which is available for free there. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for that wonderful research. And I and Tom can assure that this is research worth going deeper into. And so please follow up with Jen's website. This is really exciting research into the Seattle system. And what I love that was emphasized just now, among other things, was that, you know, democracy dollars is not a silver bullet, but it creates an opening. So, for example, if you had a place where they didn't allow anyone to vote, or they didn't have primaries to decide a party, just by allowing people to vote, or just by allowing there to be primaries for open primaries for a party, doesn't mean suddenly progress is made, but it means that 5 years down the line, someone can get together and say, oh, we have this voting thing that we can use to make progress, or we have this open primary we could use to shake up the party. And this is the same thing. We have this democracy voucher system that we could use to raise money, to win, to make change. So it's about creating that opening and making that opening bigger and bigger for diversity and participation. So this was a wonderful outline of the what. So now let's move to the how, the strategy session. What strategies can we use to promote democracy dollars, which is why many folks are here. Great person to turn to is someone who has fought for the original Seattle and Washington democracy voucher system, which is Estevan Muñoz-Howard. He's the director of program strategy at the Marguerite Casey Foundation, and he was part of the group that helped push for democracy vouchers in Seattle and Washington as a whole. So Estevan, could you tell us the story of your experience pushing for this, and what lessons did you learn? What are the takeaways? What would you do if you could do it all over again for these folks in the audience that are interested in learning about fighting for this in their state?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Really appreciate you putting this call together and bringing folks together around democracy vouchers. It's been exciting to see a lot of the growth and the research and efforts to replicate it around the country. And I guess I'll just start out by saying I would love to be a resource to anyone who is looking to advance this reform elsewhere. I think it's a really, really important addition to the toolbox that we all have. And so I'll start out by saying, so until just recently, I was working as a senior program officer with the Piper Fund, which is a donor collaborative that supports community-led efforts to build a healthy democracy. If you are interested in, if you're at a point where you're actually looking to advance some of these reforms, or want to talk with, if you want to have a conversation around funding your effort, I would recommend tracking down Piper Fund to at least to be able to have a conversation around what that might look like. Although now I currently work at Marguerite Casey Foundation, but still continue to be plugged into to efforts to sort of elevate this program around the country. As far as the story of how this got passed in Seattle, I'll start out by saying we didn't begin with the plan, with an intention to pass democracy vouchers in Seattle. For many years, a group of us have been organizing around money and politics reform in the city. Initially, we figured that we were going to pursue a small donor matching system, like a 6-to-1 matching system, similar to what's been implemented in New York. And that was our starting point. We brought together a group of folks around that. There was some support from City Council to explore that policy solution. But ultimately, we had a couple of false starts. We had a campaign in 2013 that fell a little short, although it was such a narrow loss that it actually helped us build momentum. And then in 2014, we tried to get the City Council to refer this to the ballot again and fell one vote short on City Council to get this back on the ballot. But at that point, we were able to build a strong enough coalition and secure enough financial commitments that we realized we didn't actually have to worry about what was politically palatable for City Council. And that we built a strong enough coalition that we could think more aspirationally about what we wanted to pursue. And at the time, several of us were familiar with the idea of a democracy voucher program. We'd read about it, we were interested in it. but it had never been implemented anywhere. And so it felt like a big leap, but we decided to include it in some of the polling, some of the research that we were doing as we figured out how to proceed for 2015. And what we found was that across the board, there was more support for a democracy voucher program than a public matching system. And that was true among progressives as well as conservatives and libertarians. And we realized that, I think a couple of the reasons for that is that this is understood as a market-based solution, right? I think that's actually one of the core reasons why we see more support across the board, is that it's not some individual in an office somewhere who's making decisions about who's going to get the funding. If you're the strongest candidate and you tell the best story, then you're going to be more successful in raising democracy vouchers. And so I think that was a really critical component, that where we realized this was a new path forward. And with the levels of support that we saw, we realized that we didn't really see another path. We felt like we wanted to see where this could take us. So we started, as we got to that point in the campaign, it was late 2014, we set some goals for ourselves as a coalition, that we knew we wanted to mitigate the influence of corporate and oligarchic interests in our democracy. We knew we wanted to amplify the voices of regular folks and people who are not actively either engaged by or engaged in the system. We knew we wanted to do it in a way that was equitable. And we knew we wanted to add a new tool to the toolbox. So when we started to think about democracy vouchers, we realized, it has to pass somewhere. We might not get it right, but if we can at least add a new tool to the toolbox, other folks can build on it and tweak it and improve on it. And there actually are some things that I wish we had done here that now we're seeing being proposed elsewhere, which I can talk about in a little bit. But that was what we came up with. Another thing that I would want to mention is that as we were thinking about democracy vouchers and putting this ballot initiative language together, we were clear from the start that we did not want to just focus on democracy vouchers. And so I think that's actually one thing that I want to make sure is elevated in this conversation, that if you're taking away one thing from this, it's not to go out and run a democracy voucher program all by itself. I think there are ways that could be successful, but I think if we had done that here in Seattle, we would not have won in 2015. So when we were putting this ballot initiative together, we were really clear that we wanted to wrap the democracy voucher program in a set of other provisions that were really popular, that could help buoy the overall proposal, and that we could have additional talking points as well. So we're not just limited to the one taxable measure. And so what we did was we wrapped the democracy voucher program in provisions around contribution limits. We lowered contribution limits to $500 so we could shrink the gap between the largest and smallest gift. We included provisions around reporting and disclosure of political giving. We included provisions around lobbying reform to try to stop that, curb the revolving door of elected officials then working for in the industries that they regulate. We implemented a ban on contributions from corporations with large government contracts. And we increased fines and penalties for election law violations, because we knew that a system like this would make people nervous and make people worry that, worried that we might see additional instances of fraud down the line. So we wanted to be able to head off some of those potential lines of attack by starting out with all of these other provisions that we knew were popular. And that when we were running the campaign, we actually never started by talking about democracy vouchers. We always started with everything else, because we knew that these things would draw people in. And if they were comfortable ending on talking point number 3, and they're supportive of the campaign, then that's great. We have their support. Let's continue building. What we didn't want to do was get stuck in the details of how democracy vouchers worked, because we knew if we were trying to explain how it works, get stuck in the math of how you fund it all, and how do these numbers match up, then we're losing. Because if it sounds confusing, then people are going to reject it. And so I think that was a really important takeaway, was having these other provisions was critical to our success. And so in 2015, it passed with over 60% of the vote. It was a really strong victory. And the results have been really, I think, exciting to see. Jen talked a little bit about some of the impacts, the increase in number of donors. We've had more candidates running for office than ever before. We're seeing better representation among the donor community. We've also seen some research come out recently that showed that non-voters, people who are eligible to vote but had never voted before, after using a democracy voucher in 2017, were 10 times more likely to vote in that election. We saw similar results among voters who had voted in fewer than a quarter of elections for which they were eligible, seeing 7 times more likely to vote in that election after using a democracy voucher. And so what this tells me is that this is more than just a money in politics solution. It's also a voter engagement and voter participation solution. And it's an opportunity to break the cycle of disengagement that we see, right? When you have communities that are less likely to donate, less likely to vote in the first place, it justifies candidates not going to their door because they say, well, we need to use our money well, and this is not going to be a good use of our resources. And so it justifies them not showing up in the first place, which then makes it less likely that those communities are going to turn out in the next election to begin with. With democracy vouchers, everyone's a potential donor. And so we're seeing more candidates run their campaigns differently, showing up to more doors. If those residents then use their voucher and are more likely to vote in that election, then all of a sudden, for the next cycle, they're a likely donor and they're a likely voter, which then justifies those candidates, even the privately financed candidates, that come to their door. So I think these are just a couple of takeaways that I have that definitely inform how we're talking about it nationwide. Again, there are several efforts to replicate the program around the country. Would love to be a resource however I can. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Estevan. And I love this emphasis. This is why we're so excited about democracy vouchers. It doesn't just change the candidates. It doesn't just change the election to make it more technically fair. It changes the people. It increases democracy. It expands more power to more people in more ways. It increases participation. Now, we've heard a lot about Seattle, but democracy vouchers campaigns have spread all across the country, red states and blue states, and many state houses. So I was so proud that my own hometown delegate in Northern Virginia, Delegate Marcus Simon of the Virginia House of Delegates, is one of the state house vanguards on pushing for democracy legislation statewide. And he pushed in 2018 for HB 263. This was before the Seattle results had gone back. He went out on a limb to help expand this cutting edge idea. Delegate Simon, we'd love to hear, how did you first hear about democracy vouchers? How did you start thinking about pushing for it in your state house? What did you learn from the effort for future pushes in state houses for democracy vouchers?
Sure. So I think what Pete's saying is it's a very polite way of saying I'm the what not to do person, I think, a little bit here. I will say that I wish I had met Estevan before. But as Pete said, we were early on in this and really came, and it's interesting that Estevan talked about how their campaign was wrapped up in a bunch of other sorts of campaign finance reforms. Because, I started out with an interest in, it's funny, Virginia is really a wild west of campaign finance. We have no contribution limits, no restrictions on who can contribute. So corporations, nonprofits, anybody can contribute. Well, not nonprofits, but corporations, all kinds of entities can contribute. And there's no limit on what you can spend the money on. So we don't even have a basic personal use exclusion for money in politics in Virginia. So I was very interested in those topics. But then you get to the point of, well, if we ban this and we ban that and we limit this, how do we actually pay for campaigns? I mean, we're Democrats. We want to actually be able to pay people a living wage and pay staff and things like that. So that's why I got interested in looking at some public finance models. I thought if we want to shut off the streams of revenue that we think are corrupt or corrupting or have a negative influence on democracy, what other revenue stream can we open up to sort of replace that? Would that make people more likely to support some of the other reforms that I was interested in doing? So that's what got me sort of looking at what sort of public finance options were out there. And then I just sort of stumbled upon what the folks were up to in Seattle. I think for a lot of the reasons that you've heard advocates articulate, it was a really exciting idea to me. I think some other folks were talking about just creating a fund for people to draw on, or a match, or a tax checkoff, or some of those ideas. But because of some of the ancillary benefits of democracy vouchers. I thought that was a really cool tool to be able to use. And so we wrote up a bill that basically just said, how would we take something that Seattle is thinking about doing and apply that statewide? And that's probably where I started to go wrong, right? I mean, we went real big, real fast, and tried to do this at a statewide level, probably before we were ready for prime time. And again, the goal was to get the conversation started, to get people in Virginia thinking about public financing, to sort of say, hey, it's not just about what we can't do or want to stop doing, but what can we start doing as far as campaign finance is concerned as a replacement. We don't have initiative and referendum in Virginia, so we are limited in getting things on the ballot. So the other obstacle we were up against was obviously all the folks that have successfully been elected to the General Assembly under the current system kind of like the current system, right? It was working well for them. And I came, when I was Democrats were still in the minority in 2018 when I put the bill in. And the big opposition came from the leadership on the Republican side that was sitting pretty, getting big checks from energy companies, tobacco companies, payday lenders, you name it. They could give unlimited amounts to candidates in Virginia. So why would you stop that and give your potential rivals an opportunity to compete by being able to tap into this other source? And so that was probably was really the source of the opposition. But like Estevan said, because it came in without a how to pay for it, and because we didn't have a cap on the overall amount, I think Tom was talking about how there's an overall cap in Seattle. Because we were sort of just introducing the concept, all the things you would imagine could go wrong did. People are like, well, what if this ends up costing, we said every voter in Virginia a $50 voucher, that could be $500 million and this could end up costing us. Delegate Simon wants you to vote for a $500 million tax increase. We're like, all right, slow down. That's not how it's going to work. And who's going to pay for it? How's it going to be paid for? And essentially, I mean, the accusation, which I can't say was unfair, was that the idea was sort of half-baked. And so that's the opposition we ran into. I've since sort of pared down my ambition on this for Virginia. And I think in Virginia, I don't know some of the other states out there, but we're a Dillon rule state, meaning localities have only the authority that's explicitly granted by the General Assembly, the state legislature. So what we're going to try and do is empower localities to implement this on their own on a sort of a pilot basis so that we get it scaled and we get buy-in from communities where it could happen. The city of Falls Church, where I live, is a small city. I think it would love to try something like this. In a lot of localities, you find that the only people giving to local campaigns, frankly, are real estate developers because they're the only ones who have a big financial stake in what happens at these local governments. I know that there's some desire for people to do that. My bill was tied to a clean campaign pledge. The same sort of similar to what you do. You'd have to agree voluntarily to not take the corporate contributions, to certain limits on what outside contributions you could take, not to use it for personal use and for accounting and things like that. But essentially in Virginia, that was we went for the whole hog all at once at one time. So my suggestion to those of you in state legislatures thinking about this would not be to do it that way, right? Take a more incremental approach. I think you need to socialize the idea with people, get them to understand what some of the benefits are. But if you're thinking about a public finance proposal, and we've seen this now in HR 1 too. I mean, the idea is out there more than it was in 2018, certainly more accepted than it was in 2015. But my advice would be to look for opportunities to do pilots, to do small scale, to get buy-in, and then as we see these results from Seattle too coming in, but having some more data points to point to show how it can be successful and avoid some of the pitfalls would be the way to go.
Thank you so much for that story, Delegate Simon. And this is the example we're seeing in Seattle too, as Estevan showed, that you have to go at this multiple times. This is not a one, we like being optimistic and saying we're gonna get a bunch of bills in 2022, but those are just the beginning of this story of socializing this idea. Can we get local pilot projects? Can we get people understanding that this isn't some strange thing? This is actually a really wonderful way of doing this, and then move up and up and up to the point where Gillibrand's congressional democracy vouchers program can eventually pass. So thank you for sharing that. And in that spirit, we have a perfect next speaker, which is that this is a local push for democracy vouchers that has been, and it's not all pushed through legislation. You can also push through ballot initiatives. In South Dakota, a deep red state, a ballot initiative for democracy vouchers did pass. It was only blocked by the legislature after the people said they wanted it. And another ballot initiative story we have here is out of Austin. Andrew Allison is an entrepreneur and advocate in Austin, Texas. And through Austinites for Progressive Reform, he pushed 4 ballot initiatives this past May, one of which was democracy vouchers. It unfortunately did not pass, but it got close. Could you tell us about your journey, Andrew, in pushing at the local level for democracy vouchers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Andrew, and I'm the founder of Austinites for Progressive Reform, as well as More Perfect Texas, which I'll talk a bit about. But Austinites for Progressive Reform was a ballot measure campaign in Austin, Texas, that aimed to pass a series of democracy reforms at the local level through a petition campaign. And we succeeded in making Austin the largest city in the country to now be electing its mayors in presidential November ballots. And we also succeeded in making us the second largest city in the country to adopt ranked choice voting. But we fell short on democracy dollars. More Perfect Texas, as an aside, is a new project that provides startup funding as well as operational support to local Texas organizers across the state at no cost to help them lead ballot measure campaigns for democracy reforms in their communities. But I'll talk a little bit about the Austin campaign and a few things that helped and a few things that hurt us. One, localizing the problem really helped. We were able to talk about the impact of big money in Austin in particular. Thanks to the work of reformers who had come before us, we had a data set of campaign contributions by zip code and geography, and we used that to tell a story about how 70% of cash in Austin city elections comes from our 3 wealthiest council districts, and less than 10% of the cash in city elections comes from our 4 majority Black and brown council districts. So we were able to really explain how this problem of big money is not just a problem at the federal or state level, but even in deep blue Austin as well. The data from Seattle was another huge help. We're so grateful to the Seattle team for doing this and spending the time to get this across the finish line, to be pioneers in the way they were, and to the research from folks like Dr. Heerwig, because using that data helped to get folks here in Austin very comfortable with the idea of trying this thing that they hadn't really heard of in the past. We were able to talk about how we could increase the number and diversity of donors and candidates and voters through this program and point to real results. So that was highly persuasive, especially when speaking with big influencers in the city and newspaper editorial boards and things like that. This network was extraordinarily valuable too. We were able to talk to a lot of people who are on this call right now for advice, for introductions, for policy support. We had our draft reforms reviewed by folks in the National Democracy Dollars community, financial support as well. So this is a really wonderful group, and it was really invaluable for us in getting our campaign to where it got. But ultimately, timing is everything. We had support from a lot of influential people. We had the important newspaper endorsement in Austin. We had our mayor coming out for it, local congressional candidates, our most influential council member, Beto O'Rourke, came out in support of democracy dollars, in support of our reform. But we had the vote during ironically, a low turnout off-year election in this past May. Now, we had thought that we would have the ballot all to ourselves after we filed our petition. But after we filed, another campaign came in with a much more controversial reform that they collected signatures on. And it was a reform geared at motivating exactly the folks in Austin who would oppose democracy dollars. So we ended up having a kind of uniquely unfavorable low turnout May election. And we could see this in the precinct by precinct data. The good news is we passed the other reforms, but also we saw, looking precinct by precinct and looking at relative turnout levels to November federal elections, that we would have won if this had occurred, if this vote had occurred in November of 2020 or a presidential election. So we are going to bring it back in November of 2024, and we expect it'll pass then. And this experience of getting people familiar with it will, I think, have helped a lot to make it an easier road in 2024. I really appreciate the chance to be a part of this session. And I want to point out that we've left our website from the campaign up so that folks who are interested in this can look at our messaging and our policy documents and how we explained this and how we actually wrote it up. So that's at austinprogress.org. And if anyone would like to reach out with more questions, please email me. My email address is andrew@moreperfecttexas.org. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew. And a wonderful note to end on that we need multiple, once more into the breach. We need many goes at this to educate people on this new transformative idea. And we wanted to end specifically with a message that it isn't just state politicians pushing at the state level, but citizen advocates as well. Our final panelist, Olivia Zink of Open Democracy in New Hampshire, has been pushing for a democracy dollar system in the Granite State. And similar to Andrew, two wonderful citizen advocates pushing to change their city and state. Olivia, could you share your story of pushing for this over the past years and what others can learn from your effort in New Hampshire?
Sure. Thank you so much. And I want to thank Representative Marjorie Porter, who's on the call today, who is the prime sponsor of this legislation here in New Hampshire for 2022. But I think one of the most important lessons, the first strategy we used is we did a lot of research before designing this policy. We looked at the policies in Maine and Connecticut, which were grant models, and to decide on which model of public financing we wanted to use. We decided on what we call voter dollars in New Hampshire. We did not take Seattle's democracy vouchers because vouchers didn't fly for our state. We named them voter dollars. So we really sort of shaped the policy for what worked and what messaging worked in New Hampshire. And instead of calling it public financing of elections, we called it voter-owned elections because we really wanted to use that engagement strategy of like, we want you to own the elections instead of the corporate interests that currently are owning our elections. So we use vocabulary, voter-owned elections here in New Hampshire because we really want the perspectives of voters to be the ones that are represented as the core to this policy. New Hampshire is a uniquely purple state. We're sometimes blue and sometimes red. We're red right now. And so we knew in us, the strategy in developing our policy is that we needed bipartisan support on this legislation. And so one of the strategies we did on developing the policy is working with Republicans and Democratic legislators to really talk through the policy details and to make sure that there's agreement on what are the qualifying contributions and other things as we design the policy to really make sure we were grounded in that bipartisan formation, and also really do embrace some of the conservative messaging on this. I think Roger Cates of Maine is somebody who I've quoted many times who talks about the public financing system and why we have to pay for it. And I think it's really important that we use some of the conservative talking points around we currently are paying for taxpayers are paying for privately financed elections with the tax breaks we give to big corporations, and to really be able to sort of use that sort of how do we pay for it language and lean into it, that we currently are paying for the privately financed elections, which is why we need a different model. What's really important, I think, to do when you're doing the research and design is understanding all of the numbers to know how much money is flowing into your states and in which ways. And so we learned a lot about how much money was coming from outside donors to our states. And we really leaned into this messaging around we wanted New Hampshire voters to be the ones owning our elections. We did not want the out-of-state donors and the out-of-state money in our elections. So we also have a policy design around limiting out-of-state money coming into our elections and the independent expenditures. So we did couple this public financing policy with some IE reform and some disclosure requirements to just make it a stronger package. Also, one of the things that we did in New Hampshire is held a lot of focus groups, strategy sessions. We really wanted to make sure that this was rooted in citizen advocacy. And as we developed those strategies, we had to adjust our strategies based on our landscape changing. So, you know, when there were a lot of Democratic presidential candidates coming to New Hampshire, we talked about voter dollars to the presidential candidates. We adjusted our strategy when we're talking to Republican legislators. And so I think it's also important in developing your strategies is also adjusting and fine tuning them, because persistence was really an important key to a strategy because we had to keep trying. We still have not gotten over the finish line here in New Hampshire. But the other piece of strategy that is really important, I'm a policy wonk. I love this policy. I love to talk about page 5, line 6 of the bill around qualifying contributions. Nobody cares about that. And so what I needed to learn when I'm selling this is that we needed to sell the outcomes. We needed a rebalanced system. We needed, we want a government that's accountable to people and representatives, and not sell line 5, page 6 of the bill. Although you do need to understand that. And then I think about our campaigns in sort of 3 phases of power. The first phase of power is developing the bill to win the policy inside. But the second phase of power is the people you need, the coalitions, the money, all of the pieces of this bill that you need to organize to win the policy gain. And the third phase of power is really around building a narrative around why people want to change our campaign finance system. And I think one of the biggest selling points is, do we keep our status quo system or do we venture to change it? And I think across the board, people do not like our privately financed system and are really looking for solutions, eager for solutions, hungry for solutions, because they want to see the problems that big money has in our process changed. So I think it's really important that you not just look at the policy, but look at, how do we build a coalition? How do we build citizen advocates? How do we develop champions? How do we organize? And how do we also tell a story that's about changing the narrative of the corruption and really rooting it in policy solutions that will change the power structure.
Thank you, Olivia. What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you to all of our panelists, and they are all here to help into the future. They are on this call because they care about this. In the final 30 seconds before you leave, we're going to pop a poll right up front right now. And it's going to, and this is important, we're going to get this info to us. It's not just the final poll numbers. You can choose basically, are you an office that's interested in raising up democracy dollars in the coming session or year as a ballot initiative if you're not a state office? Are you interested and you can't raise up in the coming year, but you still want to follow along with this working group, or are you not interested? For those that are interested, we are going to follow up. We're going to have a second session where we get into the real nuts and bolts. We're going to add people to a Slack. We're going to have an email list, and we're going to keep pushing and working together for an interstate push for democracy dollars. And if you're interested in future transformative policies, visit democracypolicy.network. If you go to democracypolicy.network/join, you will hear about future events. A reminder, all of the biggest policies, minimum wage, abolition, suffrage, marriage equality, Social Security, they all began in the cities and states and people going out on a limb to push for a new idea or push to be the second to expand a new idea. And then it burbled upwards. So we can start this revolution in campaign finance in the states as well. Thank you, everyone. So glad to have you here. And thank you so much to our panel of wonderful trailblazers for an exciting campaign finance system that expands more power to more people in more ways.